Is there? There we go.
Good morning and
Good
welcome
morning.
to the 22nd episode of the limited video series of literary and critical conversations. Friends, Setu is honored to have a very distinguished guest today whose translation got the 2022 International Booker Prize. The accessible, grounded, and sensitive scholar, Dr. Daisy Rockwell. Her brief intro: Daisy Rockwell is an artist and Hindi-Urdu translator living in the US. She has translated numerous classic literary works from Hindi and Urdu into English, including Bhishma Sahni's Tamas and Khadija Mastoor's The Women's Courtyard. Her translation of Geetanjali Shree's Tomb of Sand was the winner of the 2022 International Booker Prize and the 2022 WARK Prize for Women in Translation. In 2020, she was the winner of MLA's Aldo and Jean Scaglione Prize for translation of a literary work for Krishna Sobati's A Gujarat Here, A Gujarat There. In 2023, she was awarded the Vani Foundation Distinguished Translator Award. She has received several grants for her translations, including 2 from National Endowment for the Arts, 1 from the National Endowment for the Humanities. She received her PhD in South Asian literature from the University of Chicago, where she studied Hindi literature, translation, and social sciences under A.K. Ramanujan, Susan Hober Rudolph, and Colin P. Masica. She is currently the translator in residence at Princeton University. I, Sangeeta Sharma, extend a hearty welcome to a legend called Daisy Rockwell. And let me confess, Daisy Rockwell really rocks. Welcome, dear Daisy Rockwell. Thanks for joining us and making this morning a memorable one.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Now, let's begin the conversation with the recent landmark of your career, Tomb of Sand.
Okay.
That won the Booker Prize in the year 2022 for translated fiction, incidentally, the first one for Hindi language. A remarkable feat for both the translator and the author Geetanjali Shree for the singular honor. Well, tell me, Daisy, how did the subject come to claim your attention as a reader and creative translator, the theme of the novel that got the Booker?
You mean the theme of Partition or the other themes?
Of the novel?
Yeah, so I was asked to consider translating it by a Bangla translator, Arunava Singha, who's very well known in India. And he had been approached by the publisher Tilted Axis Press by Deborah Smith, who incidentally is the first winner of the International Booker Prize for her translation of the Korean novel, The Vegetarian.
Yeah.
And she had read Geetanjali's novel Mai in translation, and she had heard there was a new book, and she was interested in publishing that. And so I happened to be in India at the time, so I picked up the book and read a bit, and I translated just a tiny amount, like 5 pages, and sent it to Geetanjali to see if she approved. And she did. And so then I translated a sample. A sample is usually about 25 pages or 25 to 40 pages
Mm.
that you give to a publisher to see if they want to go ahead with it. That sample was strangely difficult to do. I didn't realize how difficult the book would be. And so even the first 5 pages, that was pretty challenging because as if you've read the book, you know, like, for example, there's the part where Ma says, me utungi nahi,
Mm-hmm.
nahi, nai, nai. And so she turns it into this pun between, she slides, because people pronounce no, nahi, as nai, if they're speaking quickly, right? So she transitions from nahi to nai, and then it says me utungi nai,
Uh-huh.
right? So, like, how do you do that in English? It's like a pun, but it's not funny. Like, it's not necessarily funny.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like this wordplay. So that in itself was extremely difficult. And then I did this sample, and the funny part is that I have translated a lot of partition novels, but I did not realize that this was a partition novel until I had already agreed to do it. So for a while I thought, oh, this is my first novel that has nothing to do with partition, but then it turned out I was completely wrong. And that was a bit of a surprise because if you've looked at Hindi books, you know that the blurbs on the back are utterly unhelpful.
Mm.
They don't tell you a single thing. Like the way that English books are, you look at the back and then you can tell right away
Correct.
what's kind
Yeah.
of, if this is my kind of thing, should I pick this book up? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's a romance, it's an adventure, it's very serious. It's set in the 19th century. Like, just these, like, you want to know these things and then you decide to buy the book. But
Mm-hmm.
Hindi books, like, do not have this information. They have like a very scholarly kind of assessment from usually a scholar. So it's like very elevated language, and it doesn't really tell you anything about what kind of a book it is. So and nobody told me, Geetanjali didn't tell me. So nobody told me what this book was about or anything. It was all a process
Oh.
of
Uh-huh.
discovery. Um, and I agreed to do it pretty early on just because I found the writing so unusual and fascinating. And of course, that turned out to be a monumental challenge for a translator, much more than I could possibly have imagined. And periodically just felt like giving up because I didn't see how I could get through it.
Yeah, what you said, the translation part is really difficult because
Mhm.
um, the creative writer is autonomous. He or she
Mhm.
can write what he wants to, whereas
Yeah.
the translator has to do justice with the text and see
Mhm.
that the intent, style, and tone of the creative writer remains intact.
Right.
Yeah, so it
Exactly.
becomes all the more challenging.
Yes, exactly.
Well, so I understand that it was destiny that brought you together, Geetanjali, Shree, and you.
hmm
Earlier, you had translated Tamas by the iconic Bhishma Sahani, now the Ret Samadhi as the Tomb of Sand.
hmm
So, is it a coincidence that traumatic events like the partition of India continue to engage your mind over the intervening years? Or is it the human side, the untold sufferings, the
hmm
tragedies of massive dislocations, disruptions due to a retreating imperialistic power?
Well, I would say that, as I just pointed out, the fact that Red Samadhi turned out to be a partition novel was a complete surprise. But when I first started reading Hindi literature, it's actually kind of a funny story. I was in graduate school, very early in graduate school, and I had a very eccentric Hindi professor. He wasn't Indian, He was a linguist, a really brilliant linguist.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew many, many languages, and he would get kind of bees in his bonnet about language pedagogy and then try them out. So he said he was concerned that the way that students are taught South Asian languages in the United States, they never get to this point where they can just sit down and read because they're taught them kind of like an ancient language, like you translate word for word, like you don't get to this point where you just sit down and read, and like if you don't understand something, so what? Because that's how we all learn how to read, right? At first you don't know all these words and concepts, but you just are interested, so you just keep going and your brain can pick up the pieces, and that's how we develop a
Yeah.
vocabulary and so on, is
Yes.
by exposure, right? So he wanted me to, he was experimenting on, well, not just me, there were a few other people in the class, but I was the person who was most focused on literary topics. So he wanted us to learn how to read rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he was very eccentric. So what did he choose for us to read but Yashpal's Jhuta Sach, which is an enormous book. It's like 1,000 pages.
Uh-huh.
And
Odd.
it's in two parts, and it's about the partition. And the first half is pre-partition, and then the second half is post-partition. Um, and but like, what? Who chooses 1,000 page book for the first? Like, I'd never read a novel in
Mm-hmm.
Hindi. I'd read some short stories and things like that. So you would think it would be like make more sense to choose just, something normal, 200 pages or something like that. But no, he chose this novel. And Yashpal's writing style is kind of a little bit journalistic. Like it's not fancy writing. It's kind of pretty straightforward, should Hindi not in the dialogues but in the description.
I see.
So what I would do is I would create flashcards for
Mm.
the words that repeatedly came up that I didn't know, and it was a lot of words, because I couldn't read rapidly. I didn't have a good enough vocabulary, so I started memorizing all these words, doing tons of flashcards, and I just got hooked. This book has a great plot,
Mm.
like it's like very searing and detailed, and like he uses newspaper reports, and like there's a lot of information in that book that you can't even get in a history book about them, about the abduction of women and repatriation of women and stuff like that. But the plot is also good. It's not just like full of detailed information. It's like a page turner.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually drew me in, and I became kind of obsessed with it. And everyone else in the class abandoned the book at a certain point, like, because they weren't doing, I was obsessively learning these words, but they weren't doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I read the entire thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like took over my whole consciousness. Because I didn't know, I knew like very little about the partition before. I did like the bare facts, like a little bit from a history book, and I'd seen the Gandhi movie or something. So
Okay.
I became totally obsessed um, with these stories that I read, and I think that I've never really shaken that obsession. And I find it, it's not just that specific partition. I came to learn that there are other partitions in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and that, and the relationship to colonialism and imperialism and the divide and rule and all of these kinds of things. And so by now I'm really um kind of an expert, not just as like in a scholarly way about the topic, but as a translator, because I've translated so many works set at that time. It's like I feel like I've lived in, Lahore in the 40s. I know all these architectural details. because I'm constantly having to translate, for example, the way that people would jump from roof to roof trying to escape because the gullies were very narrow.
Uh-huh.
So if there was a mob coming through a gully, you couldn't really outrun it. So you would run away on the rooftops because the houses were all stuck together. So like so then you have to understand how to translate these different parts of the roof.
Yeah.
And they're at one point they're like pushing their latrines off the roof onto the mobs. So there's all these kinds of details that I have to understand, or like how the windows open. So I know this has nothing to do with like generational trauma and so on like that, but a translator has to know all these things. And so what's the funny part about translating Reid Samadhi in Tomb of Sand is that once I got to the third section, I was totally like, this was just easy because
Okay.
I knew the whole landscape and I knew all the literary tropes and I knew the deep history and I know I've been to Lahore and so that was like the breezy part for me. And a lot of people say, oh, that must have been really hard because it's like historical and it's traumatic and everything like that. But you have not translated Damas, which is pretty brutal because if you're translating, you do several drafts. And to like read about the women jumping with the children into the well over and over like 10, 15 times trying to get the language right. That is like pretty traumatizing to
Yeah.
have to do.
Yeah. So if you have visited the places, it really helps. So you said you have been
Oh
to
yeah,
Lahore, yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
and to India as well. So
Yes.
should I take it as that you are fascinated by the historical moment which changes everything dramatically? And
Yeah,
that's
and
why,
as you must know, these kinds of historical moments are sort of like catnip for novelists because like when you can reverse the fortunes of every single
oh
character.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's like a very exciting premise for
yes.
a writer to use.
Well, what exactly is it that draws you to a writer in a language other than English? The
Hmm.
select Urdu and Hindi writers that you engage with, commonalities or differences, if any?
Well, I think I like unusual writing very much. So, whether it's in English or Hindi or Urdu, I love writers that experiment with style. And so that's what kind of keeps me with Geetanjali, even if it can be very difficult. And I'll tear my hair out at some of her sentences. If you've read some of her work in Hindi,
Mhm.
it's like really hard to untangle sometimes what she's trying to say. And when I ask her what she means, things get no better because, she's an artist and she's like not sitting down analytically putting these words together. But at the same time, yeah, the way that a writer uses language is because there's a part of me is sort of a linguist. So even in English, I love it when a writer is using language in an unusual way that surprises me on the
Mhm.
sentence level, sentence by sentence. I actually have a very hard time reading books that are written in an ordinary kind of straightforward style. Like I can't, my mind doesn't engage with them because I'm such a like a micro reader
Mhm.
and translating because I translate so much that makes it even worse. I can't just let a bunch of text sort of enter me and like not pay any attention to these nitty gritty details.
Mhm. Well, that's very insightful.
Mhm.
It's surely going to help the stakeholders the way you have described the similarities and dissimilarities. So,
Mhm.
what are the similarities between the Urdu and Hindi literary landscapes, especially the short and long fictions written in
Mhm.
these two supple languages with their respective traditions and rich heritage?
Well, I like to say that um, the difference between Hindi and Urdu literature is that Urdu literature is like a stately older woman, sort of an elegant,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, stylish lady with beautiful clothes and like receiving you in her drawing room.
Yeah.
And Hindi is like an unruly teenager, a disruptive. um, and
Wonderful.
and the reason why I say this is because Urdu has been around for a long time, for hundreds of years, and what we call Hindi now has as a literary language has really only been around since like the end of the 19th century. So it's actually quite young. Because it's taking Khadi Boli, which is
Right.
the
Yeah.
spoken form of in both Hindi and Urdu is Khadi Boli.
Mm-hmm.
And so modern standard Hindi is taking Khadi Boli,
Mm-hmm.
which was not used as a literary language if and for people that write in Devanagari. Like there was Braj Bhasha and Avadi, Purbi Hindi and all these things
Mm-hmm.
were used in the Devanagari script, but Kariboli was not used in Devanagari. So it's taking Kariboli, writing it in Devanagari and turning it into a modern language. So it's actually very young, and you find a lot more experimental usages of language, and because it Hindi writers conceive of themselves linguistically as this much larger group. Like Urdu has set, it's got it all figured out. This is how we do
Mm-hmm.
things. And I mean this on the level of the sentence, like of grammar and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Hindi, there is this consciousness of the roots in all these other languages I just mentioned, like Avadi and Bhojpuri and all these things. And there has been a strong regionalist bent to it as well. So there's authors that grew up speaking Mathili or Punjabi, who bring in the flavors of that language as well into their writing, and their dialogue will often
Yeah,
be
that's very important.
either colored by it or even straight up in those languages. Um, so it makes it very hard for a translator that like is not, especially for someone like me who's not a native speaker,
Mhm.
because people will just like be speaking, in effect, the dialogues could be in many different languages.
Mhm.
And there will be regionalisms and there will be muhavras and all these kinds of things
Yeah.
that are very specific to certain places and are hard to hunt down. So it's large and unruly in that way, and the writers I think are more experimental in how they
Mm.
perceive language.
Yeah, you brought a very wonderful analogy of a sophisticated lady. Urdu is like a sophisticated lady, whereas Hindi is like an unruly teenager.
Yeah.
That's very nice. I was quite fascinated to read in one of your interviews that Urdu is like French. And Hindi is
Mhm.
like Spanish in the sense
Yes.
that Spanish is all over Latin America and nobody can
Mhm.
control it
Yes.
because it has a crazy amount of vocabulary you have said there coming from
Yes.
all directions. But French has the French Academy keeping it
Mhm.
under control.
Right. And Urdu doesn't have an Urdu academy, but in effect it does. Like if you ever meet Urdu writers and critics and so on,
Mhm.
they have this very prescriptionist view of the world. They will talk about how this person uses words slightly wrong and that kind of thing. Like they
Mm,
think they have a strong vision for how things should be done and how language should be used.
that's true. So being
Mhm.
a language professor, English professor, I really like this, the way you have described and, shown the difference between Urdu and English.
Mhm.
I love that. Well, what are the challenges for a gifted translator like you with a background in the classical and modern European languages, especially when a text is evasive, playful, and escapes grasp, like the fine sand slipping through your fingers?
um, well, I think there's we think of translation, a lot of people think of translation as this simple language transfer. Like you have language A and you have language B, and you have to bring it all across. Like the Latin roots for translation is like carrying trans across the lot is late is like carrying. So it's like you're carrying something across. Whereas, for example, in Hindi, the word is anuvad, which
Anu.
is it's actually a different conceptually is like you're speaking after or retelling. It's like a more loose concept. It's not this idea of transfer as much as rephrasing or like echoing or that kind of thing. So I think that there are a lot of ways to think about translation, and though one starts a translation always on this kind of very basic linguistic level of let's get language A into language B and let's be accurate,
Mm,
there are often things that defy that process, especially if languages are linguistically dissimilar. Um, like, for example, you hear about Lydia Davis, the famous translator who she translates from French
ah,
into English, and she talks about how she tries to find cognates from French that work in English. So she tries to like match the language on this cognate level. She tries to retain the syntax of the sentences.
mhm,
But that is an absurd notion if you're translating from English to Hindi or I'm sorry, from Hindi to English or from Japanese to English or something like
mhm,
that, where there are no cognates, or if they are, they're ridiculous, because like, yes, the Indian, Northern Indian languages are all in the same linguistic family as English. They're Indo-European, so that in effect there is this relationship, but it's very ancient,
mm.
right? So like there aren't that many words that survive that are like actually like divine and divya are like that's like
Oh,
a good example where it actually would make sense to use a cognate. Um, so sometimes you get to this point where you've done everything as accurately as you can, but it doesn't sound like English and it isn't coming together. And then you have to come into your sort of anuvad phase
mhm.
where you have to retell it. And so I was just teaching a workshop yesterday on translation, and I'd say like if you get to this point where the literal transfer of one language to another is not working, you have
Mhm.
to just close your eyes and ask yourself, what is this author saying? What are they describing? Like one thing that I always have trouble with is physical descriptions, especially Geetanjali's. Like if
Mhm.
she says something that somebody did with their arms or their legs, it's when I translate it, it sounds like they're sort of like, totally
Oh,
crazy. And so I have to close my eyes and think like, but what is this person doing? What would logically make sense? Maybe they're just going like this, you
mhm.
know?
Yeah.
And that those words, the word for this is completely different from whatever she said that
Mhm.
made me end up in a pretzel over
Oh,
here. So
mhm.
you have to kind of, and that's when I bring up the idea of dhwani, that like find the echoes of what you saw in the original language and bring it into English, recreate the echoes rather than attempting to find the linguistic basis for some English sentence.
Yeah. Because keeping your hands this way, it's a yoga pose, and this is
Yeah,
crossing
exactly.
your
Yeah,
hands. So
exactly.
totally different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, then exactly. Are they doing a yoga pose or are they just like hanging out? You know,
Yeah.
what's happening here?
That's well explained.
Mhm.
Well, which texts you enjoy the most to work with? A Joycean text or impressionistic one that resists rigidities and fixed meanings?
Well, I would take either of those if they came my way. As long as I said, as long as it's not straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like that was actually a challenge for me translating Thomas
Mm.
because his writing is very straightforward, and the power is in, you know, what he's describing. But the language itself is not um super challenging, and so that is hard for me to deal with because it's too simple in a way.
And this one, Reid Samadhi, was a impressionistic one.
Yeah, but it's definitely also Joycean. Raid Samadhi is like everything. You know, it's got something for everybody in that book. And so the styles change all the time, the voices
Mm-hmm.
change, you know, things are narrated by
Mm-hmm.
like from the perspective of a door or a crow, you know. So and the narrator changes and it's um yeah, it's crazy. There's like just all different styles going on at once.
Mm-hmm. Translators, the finest ones, are in fact co-creators of texts and narratives. They bring up new vitality to a given story, add a new dimension to it. How do you feel about this close collaboration between two languages and traditions that merge finally in the translated text?
Well, yeah, I think ideally any translation that's successful will be have become its own thing. It will have taken on its own life in the new language.
Mhm.
And so um that's part of what I was talking about before of this, you know, starting out on this literal basis. And then there's a certain point where I tell people that I mentor, there's a certain point in your translation where it's time to say goodbye to the source text and the source language and move into the new, start looking at the text as a work in English. So I'm not saying that you should stamp out every sign of where it came from, but you have to start treating your translation as something that can stand on its own, that can exist on its own. And so, like, I always say that translators love metaphors, and whenever I say what I just said, in the back of my mind, I think, you know, of the negative possibilities of that, of like, imagine, you know, Dr. Frankenstein and his monster, right? So, like, it's like we've created this thing out of all these other, like, patched together this entity and breathed life into it. And then we want it to be able to walk.
Mhm.
And so, but like, will it end up looking like Frankenstein's monster? Will it sort of lurch
Mhm.
around and make everybody terrified and scream and run away? Or like, can we create something that's new, that works and lives on its own, that is also beautiful, or that also has the same um, kind of feeling that the first text had, but in its new environment. So that's kind of the trick, is like how to make it live on its own, but not be a scary monster.
Well spoken. The Booker has given prestige to the tedious job of a translator working alone with the different tools, sweating over words, and trying to find dynamic equivalences that are not merely literal. How has been your experience as a translator, now widely respected for your unique talents of storytelling?
You mean following the Booker or
No, the art of translation.
yeah.
Yes.
Um
How has been your experience as a translator?
well, yes, I think that it is very lonely, and for a long time I think that there was this notion that the translator should be invisible. That the ideal translation is one where you don't think you're reading a translation, where you think
Mhm,
you're reading something that was originally written in English or whatever the target language is.
mhm,
Um, and it's like this absurd kind of illusion that's created that if you're super good at translating, then nobody will think that nobody will even notice your existence, you know? And so as Jennifer Croft, who is also won the International Booker for her translations of Olga Tokarczuk, the Nobel award-winning Polish writer, she says she likes to point out, because she's kind of led the charge to have translators' names on the book.
mhm,
She's led the charge. And she says that people should realize that, in fact, the translator has written every word in the book
mhm,
you're reading. We wrote every single word.
mhm,
And so, even though it's all based on another text, the idea that we're not there, that we disappear, is kind of absurd. And so, I think that these ideas are changing somewhat. And so, the reason I bring this up is because it's connected to the loneliness, the isolation that translators feel. For when you translate, you're all alone, it's very isolated. And then you publish a book, and if it's very successful, no one will remember your name, right? Because you will have managed to disappear yourself from the text. Um, and so now I think that translators are coming forward a lot more. They're demanding to have their names. They're not being silent and
Yeah, I
invisible.
wanted to ask you that what needs to be done to further the cause of translation in terms of opportunities, visibility, and respect?
Yeah, well, I guess name on the cover,
Mhm,
proper payment, but most translators aren't paid
mhm,
properly at all. It's a huge amount of labor, and it's just probably no one is actually adequately compensated for the amount of labor that they put into translation, because it's like, if we were paid by the hour, no publisher would be able to afford us, right?
afford it,
So,
yeah.
but at least at some level, enough adequate pay that people can afford to take the time out to do a translation. And then just, a recognition that what we're doing is very difficult and challenging, but also creative. That we're not just people transferring language from one language to another, that what we're doing is very artful,
Mhm.
um, and is a form of creative writing as well.
That's true. So there should be more mobilization of translators in this direction, you mean to say? And they should get their due. Till now, they are not.
Well, I think publishers and booksellers
Mm,
should be giving translators more their due. Like I always say, that it would be nice if you could go
Oh,
into a bookstore and find translated literature, like there would be a section of
correct.
translated,
Yeah,
but instead you have to hunt through, through the titles.
definitely. Yeah.
And, if they like had a translation table when you walked into the bookstore or something like that. But instead, there's long been this idea that publishers and booksellers have that readers are frightened of translation, that they think it's too hard and scary.
Mhm.
And so they actually it's purposefully hiding the translations among the
Oh.
other books. And that's why they don't want to put our names on the covers, because then people will realize that it's a translation. Because there's also this weird and widespread belief that a translation is not as good, like that it's a kind of like a counterfeit of the original. So you don't want people to know that it's translated, because then they will think it's inferior and won't pick it up. So that we really need to push back against that notion that, sometimes a translation might even be better
Mm-hmm.
than the
Yeah,
source text. Is
yes.
perfectly possible. But some people say that this stems from a kind of way that readers think about translation has to do with translation of religious texts, like the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or something like that. That that if you read a translation of it, you're getting a pale imitation. It's like it's not true, like true kind of communion with the divine words in the text. But you have to remember that every novel is not like the Quran, like it's just a novel, right? And it's like not blasphemous to transfer it into another
Ah.
language.
No, but I absolutely agree that there should be a separate section in the bookshops.
Mhm.
And
Right.
people should know that these are the where they have to go for if they are looking for, translated works. And there
Hmm.
should be more royalties,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes,
for
for sure.
translators because
Hmm.
it's a difficult task, very
Hmm.
challenging, and you pour hours over
Hmm.
books for that. So
Right.
that struggle should be rewarded. Yeah, I
Yes.
call it a struggle because you have to
Hmm.
find the right word and you have to transcreate, not
Yes.
just translate.
Hmm. Right.
Yeah. What are the essential tools of a competent translator? Empathy, among others, as a crucial factor.
Hmm. Yes. Well, yeah, empathy, I think. I find most translators are fairly humble. It's not a profession to take up if you want to be in the limelight, because as I've mentioned before, you very rarely will be in the limelight. Um, so I think there's a lot of importance also being in having good intuition, and having a really strong grasp of how language works.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, a lot of people say that you should be a native speaker of the target language.
Mm.
So, like, um, you should be native in that language, but that is kind of an outmoded view, because, think of in India, where what does it mean to be a native speaker of something? Like your mother, is it your mother tongue, which you may only know
Mm-hmm.
like how to talk about babies and what's for dinner. And
Mm-hmm.
some people don't actually have a very wide vocabulary in their mother tongue, because they only speak it for like talk to servants or like talk to their grandmother or something like that. If you learned English in school, does that mean that you can't translate into English? No, I don't think so, because English is widely used in India and people are quite fluent.
Mm-hmm.
And people, many Indians have multiple fluencies of different kinds. And so I don't agree with the idea that you should be um in this traditional sense a native speaker, like that the target language be your mother tongue. I think you have to write well in the target language. That's important. But where you got it from is not so important, I think.
No, you have proven that
Hmm.
it's not important to be a native language speaker. The target
Hmm.
language should not be your mother tongue. That's not necessary. You have
Yeah.
done that and you have proved it.
Mhm.
Well,
Oh, but the target language is my mother tongue 'cause it's English. It's the
um,
source
yeah,
language is
yeah,
not
yeah,
my.
yeah, correct. Yeah, English is your
Yeah.
mother tongue, right?
Yeah, right.
But you have specialized in Hindi and Urdu.
Right. Yeah, no, which is not. Yeah.
Yeah, you have done that wonderfully well. Now, please tell us about Daisy Rockwell, the artist and the painter.
Well, I grew up with art in an artist family. Both my parents were artists. My grandfather's a famous artist as well. Um, and so when I was growing up, art was everything. It was the most important thing to my parents. It was like a religion. And so I was always, art was always happening, and I was always making art as a child and as an adolescent. Um, and then when I went to graduate school, I sort of went full intellectual and didn't make any art for about 15 years.
Mhm.
Um, and then I ended up kind of very depressed. And I couldn't actually figure out why that was. Like I didn't make the connection with no art. Um, but after I left my job, I did start to do printmaking and painting
Mhm.
and realized that that was very important for my psyche. So, I always wish that all of my interests had like somehow worked together, like that I could create that there would be this one way that they would all come together. But that doesn't necessarily happen. These are just different parts of who I am. So sometimes I have done a series of paintings that have to do with translation. But yeah, I am a translator and I'm also a painter, and that's just how it is.
You are a multi-dimensional creator.
Yes, yes.
So hats off to the artist in you.
Thank you.
What are your observations on the South Asian literature?
In general, that's
In
a big.
general, you are an expert in South Asian literature.
I mean, that's a big, huge. South Asian literature is huge, and there's things happening in so many languages
Mhm.
that we don't have any idea about, right? Like, um, I know about Hindi and Urdu, and I hear things about other languages, um, but there's just so much going on, and across the whole region, and that's why I get annoyed when people sort of feel like they've done South Asia by reading something that's written in English, because that's just actually the tip of the iceberg. That's what gets exported most easily. Um, but there's so much else to learn and to know that, and they're all different trends and things like that. So, different languages are having different, there's different focus and or like, for example, Malayalam is huge and they have a lot of thrillers and things like that, and you don't see that as much in Hindi. So it's an endless source of fascination, and I'm always excited to learn more.
Mhm. Yeah, your insights are valuable. Hence, I asked you. Your favorite lines of Urdu and Hindi, the lines that resonate with you, if you could remember randomly? or we move on?
Well, I have this problem, like I am I'm such a hardcore translator that I can't remember the original lines because as soon as I hear them, I'm translating them.
Mhm.
So then I just remember the translation. And it's kind of frustrating because people will ask me things like that, like, "Oh, what's your favorite couplet?" or something like that, and I can't remember because I translate everything as soon as it's like this instant process of the input into my
Well,
head.
if you want to give some parting words, if you would like to say here, or some tips or some message to the listeners, to the
Oh,
viewers.
well, read more translation, translate if you want to, give it a try. If you're a translator,
Mhm.
remember to do many drafts of your translation, that your translation isn't anywhere near done until you've done maybe 10 drafts or something like that. And if you feel out of touch with your mother tongue or a language that you read until you were in class 10 or something like that, don't be scared to go back in and read it. I always want people to go back. And one of the great things about Tomb of Sand winning the Booker is that many people decided that they wanted to try to read the original, which is not an easy book in Hindi.
Mhm.
But a lot of people have been reading them side by side, the English and the Hindi. People that were out of touch with Hindi for many years have brushed it off and find it very, very fulfilling. So, if you're scared to go back into that language, then find a book that's been translated, and then you can have like a crutch, if you get nervous or you feel like you don't understand enough words and you can't stand looking in the dictionary constantly.
Yeah, thanks for your inspiring words. Thanks for your quality time. Wishing you more success and glory in future. Thanks once again, Daisy.
Well, thank you for having me.
In the next episode, we will be having yet another important guest with us. Till then, bye bye. Bye bye. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Mhm.